Even if you have no interest in sewing your own clothes, understanding how to make basic alterations can be a really great skill to have, especially if you're a secondhand enthusiast like me. And lots of alterations, even when you're trying to fit something to your body, are quite easy. My mom bought this dress for herself but wasn't wearing it, so she offered it to me. I like the look of it, but it just didn't fit right, so I'm going to make some alterations and bring you along for the ride. With an alteration like this, I start by taking a good look at the garment on my body. I'm not taking measurements or anything like that at this point. I'm kind of just observing what is and isn't working. Next, I take the garment off and put it back on inside out. And this is where the real magic happens. I just kind of pick a seam and pin extra fabric away, observing how that affects the fit. You want your adjustment to be symmetrical, so try each change on both sides at once before evaluating if that's right or not. You don't have to measure to make sure it's exact, just eyeball at this point and we'll make sure they're symmetrical before we sew. This is a really experimental process. I started with the side seam and then decided the extra fabric really needed to come from the princess seam and by taking in the shoulders. Things still felt a little weird in the back, so I'm taking more fabric out of the back dart as well. On each seam that needs to be taken in, I use the pins to kind of mark the sew line that will curve nicely around my body. This doesn't mean it's super tight. You need a little bit of ease just to move comfortably, but you should also think about where you want the fabric to kind of fall away from your body. For me, on this piece, for example, I wanted the bust to be quite fitted, for the fabric to come in around my waist, but then to move away from my body around my belly. Once you're happy with the fit, take it off, careful not to stab yourself. Sometimes I'll mark where each pin is and then take them out first to avoid that, but today I'm living on the edge. On this piece, I'm taking in fabric at the shoulders, the princess seam, and the back dart. For the shoulders, I measure how much fabric is pinned away on each. There was a little more on one than the other, so I'll split the difference and mark that down from the shoulder seam. Then I'm going to remove the bias tape from that area by ripping out those stitches. I bring that over to the sewing machine and sew along my new sew lines, keeping the bias tape out of the way. For the princess seam, I'm going to do one side at a time. With the dress still inside out, I lay it so that the fabric on either side of the princess seam is flat on top of each other, and the princess seam itself is at the edge. I mark and remove each pin, and then connect the dots in a smooth curve. It may take a little bit of experience to understand when a curve is too extreme to work, but you can always experiment with loose stitches and take them out if it doesn't work. For the most part, since we already pinned it in place, it should work all right. Then you just sew along that line. At this point, I tried the dress on to make sure that that new sew line looked right. It did, so now I just have to copy that same curve onto the other side. I prefer to do this by making a series of measurements of the line I just sewed. This depends on the piece, but for this one, I measured the distance above and below the waistband where the new sew line met the old one, the distance between the new and old sew lines at 2 inches above and below the waistband and at the waistband. I copied those measurements onto the second side, connected the dots, and sewed again. On a princess seam, which is curved, it can be hard to keep the fabric laying flat as you sew, but it's really important that you do. So I used pins to encourage it to stay in place and really took my time sewing, adjusting as needed. You control the sewing machine. There are no awards for non-stop sewing. I then repeated that whole process for the back darts. I then put the dress back on, right sides out this time to make sure everything was looking nice. It was, so now I can make some cuts and sew the bias tape back on. My princess seam adjustment resulted in a mismatched seam at the armhole, as it often does. I'm eyeballing a new armhole curve on both sides, being careful not to catch the backside of the dress with my blade as I do. I trimmed the extra fabric on the shoulder seam and serged and trimmed the extra fabric along the princess seam, but I'm going to leave the extra fabric in the back dart. To trim the bias tape, I'll hold it along the edge it'll eventually be sewn, starting at the point it's still attached, until I get to the shoulder seam and mark where it hits the shoulder. I do that with both sides of both straps, add a little bit of seam allowance, and then trim. I then sew the bias tapes on either side of each strap together, right sides facing. To attach the bias tape, you want to copy whatever method was originally used to attach it. In this case, I'll fold in one side of the bias tape and sew it to the armhole edge on the right side. Then I'll fold in the other side of the bias tape, flip it to the wrong side of the armhole, and sew it in place. And that's it, a much better fit. Sometimes oversized is great, but for me a piece like this with fairly structured fabric, the wrong fit just looks sloppy. I'm much happier with this. You too can improve the fit of your clothes. It's easier than you think.